Okay, we're back. Part 2. The Wormy Spaghetti. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big, long ones and put them in a tin, and she carried the tin back to the house under her apron. I wonder what she's plotting. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch, and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. "Hey, my spaghetti's moving," cried Mr. Twit, poking it around with his fork. "It's a new kind," Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which of course had no worms. "It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat up while it's nice and hot." Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around his fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. "It's not as good as the ordinary kind," he said, talking with his mouth full. "It's too squishy." "I find it very tasty," Mrs. Twit said. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. "I find it rather bitter," Mr. Twit said. "It's got a distinctly bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next time, Twit." Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful. Then she said, "You want to know why your spaghetti was all squishy?" Mr. Twit wiped tomato sauce from his beard with the corner of a tablecloth. "Why?" he said. Why did it have a nasty bitter taste?" "Why?" he said. "Because it was worms!" cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor and rocking with horrible laughter. So, Mr. Twit, to pay back Mrs. Twit for the worms in his spaghetti, he thought up a really, really clever, nasty trick. One night, when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and he took a walking stick down into his workshed. There, he stuck a tiny round piece of wood, no thicker than a penny, onto the end of the walking stick. This made the walking stick longer, but the difference was so small that the next morning Mrs. Twit didn't notice it. The following night, Mr. Twit stuck on another tiny bit of wood. Every night he crept downstairs and added an extra tiny thickness of wood to the end of this walking stick. He did it very neatly so that the extra bits looked exactly like a part of the old stick. Gradually, but oh so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Now, when something is growing very slowly, it is almost impossible to notice it's happening. You yourself, for example, you're actually growing taller and taller and taller as every day goes by, but you wouldn't actually think it, would you? Because it's happening so slowly, you can't even notice it from 1 week to the next. It was the same with Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was all so slow and gradual that she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up to her shoulder. "That stick's too long for you," Mr. Twit said to her one day. Why so it is," Mrs. Twit said, looking at the stick. "I've had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't for the life of me think what it was." "Well, there's something wrong all right," Mr. Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself. "What can have happened?" said Mrs. Twit, staring at her old walking stick. "It must suddenly have grown longer." "Don't be a fool," Mr. Twit said. "How can a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow." "Well, what on earth has happened?" cried Mrs. Twit. "It's not the stick, you know," said Mr. Twit, grinning horribly. "It's you. You're getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time now. You've been getting shorter." "That's not true," cried Mrs. Twit. "You're shrinking, old woman," said Mr. Twit. "It's not possible," she cried. "Oh, yes, it jolly well is," Mr. Twit said. "You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days." "Never," she cried. "Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat. Look how much it's shrunk in comparison. You've got the shrinks, that's what you've got. You've got the dreaded shrinks." Mrs. Twit began to feel so trembly, she had to sit down. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, "There you are! You're sitting in the old chair and you've shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the floor." Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever as the chair as he was with the walking stick. Every night when he'd gone downstairs and stuck a bit extra to the stick, he stuck a bit extra to all four legs of Mrs. Twit's chair. Just look at you, sitting there in your same old chair, and you've shrunk so much your feet are dangling in the air. Mrs. Twit went white with fear. You've got the shrinks, you've got the shrinks, Mr. Twit cried, pointing his finger at her like a pistol. You've got them badly, the most case of shrinks I've ever seen. Mrs. Twit became so frightened she began to dribble, but Mr. Twit, still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, didn't feel sorry for her at all. I suppose you know what happens when you get the shrinks, he said. What? What happens? Gasped Mrs. Twit. Your head shrinks into your neck shrinks into your body shrinks into your legs, and then your legs shrink into your feet, and in the end, there's nothing left but a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes. I can't bear it, cried Mrs. Twit. It's a terrible disease, the worst in the world. How long have I got? Cried Mrs. Twit. How long before I finish up as a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes? Mr. Twit put on a very solemn face. At the rate you're going, I'd say you've got no more than 10 or 11 days. There's only one cure for the shrinks. Tell me, she cried. Oh, tell me quickly. We'll have to hurry, said Mr. Twit. I'm ready, I'll hurry. I'll do anything you say, cried Mrs. Twit. You won't last long if you don't, he said, giving her another grisly grin. What is it I must do? She said, clutching her cheeks. You've got to be stretched, said Mr. Twit. Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoors, where he had everything ready for the great stretching. He had 100 balloons and a lot of string. He had a gas cylinder for filling up the balloons, and he fixed an iron ring into the ground. Stand here, he said, pointing to the iron ring. And then he tied Mrs. Twit's ankles to it. When that was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string, and when it was filled with gas, it was pulled on, trying to go up and up and up and up. Mr. Twit tied the ends of the strings to the top half of Mrs. Twit's body. Some of them tied around her neck, some under her arms, some to her waist, and even to her hair. Soon there were 50 coloured balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head. Can you feel them stretching you? Mr. Twit asked. I can, she said. They're stretching me like mad. He put on another 10 balloons. The upward pull became very strong. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now. Well, there she is, getting stretched. She was tied to the ground and her arms pulled upwards by the balloons. She was unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that for a couple of days and nights to teach her a lesson. In fact, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and said something silly. Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground? She gasped. If those things around my ankles break, it'll be goodbye forever from me. And that's what gave Mr. Twit a second nasty idea. There's enough pull here to take me to the moon, Miss Twit cried out. To take me to the moon, cried Mrs. Twit. What a ghastly thought. We wouldn't want anything like that to happen, would we? Oh dear me, no, said Mr. Twit. Put some more string around my ankles quickly. I need to feel absolutely safe. Very well, my angel, said Mr. Twit. And with a ghoulish grin on his lips, he knelt down at her feet. He took a knife from his pocket, and with one quick slash, he cut through the strings holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. She went up like a rocket. Help! Save me! But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds, she was high up in the blue sky and climbing fast. Mr. Twit stood below, looking up. What a pretty sight, he said to himself. How lovely all those balloons look in the sky, and what a marvellous bit of luck for me. At last, the old hag is gone forever. And then we'll come back for part 3. Mrs. Twit comes ballooning down.